Greetings, welcome. We're back to HET 2, and we're going to proceed today discussing some more material on the marginal revolution. We're moving now to, basically we're going to talk about the theory of distribution and factor pricing. Say just a little bit though, return for a moment to Jevons and to Menger. This is relevant. William Stanley Jevons and Carl Menger both claim that the marginal revolution is really a revolution. And of course, Rawls does as well. But Marshall disagrees. Does it really matter what we think about? Well, you know, we can call it and say what we want to about it, define it as we wish. But here's why there might be problems with that, with calling it a revolution. The marginal principle was already understood. Ricardo and others understood the marginal product theory. Bentham's utility theory was already understood. So we already had utility, and then what do we have? This ends up being kind of an abstract, boring analysis of individual choice. You know, we draw Edgeworth boxes, and like, what is this? It's not interesting historical accounts of economies doing things, and so some people think, yeah, this is really not an advance. It's not a revolution. And yet, there's some very important implications in all of this. First of all, it shows that individual behavior is systematic and it's predictable in an important sense. It's predictable in the sense that it is driven by opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is fundamental. It is an inherent feature of all choices, all actions, all conscious behavior. Individuals make their choices at the margin. That's another important feature. And individuals respond to marginal changes in systematic ways, predictable ways. That's something that Marxists don't understand. It's something that people who don't know economics frequently don't understand. And it's a crucial thing if you want to understand human society and how it functions. The connection between use value and exchange value is now clear. We understand that utility, the way that people rank goods, underlies their behavior, and therefore their behavior generates the market prices, and we see how that occurs. The previous theories of exchange value and price were wrong. They were misleading, and that's an important factor. Now, it raises the issue of factor prices, and we're going to return to that in a moment. But I want to say a little bit about this, this notion, because one textbook, one very popular textbook, not this one, which is the one we use. This is, I think, a good one. There's another one which is the next bestseller, and that's the Landreth and Colander book, Colander and Landreth book. I'd consider this one, but I don't like it. And here's an example of why. They say that Menger and Jevons are wrong when they say that value depends solely on utility, and that the analysis of Jevons and Menger themselves proves that they are wrong. They just didn't understand their own analysis, and here's the argument that these guys make. They say both of them argue that quantity available determines the margin, and the quantity available determines it depends on the cost of production, so the cost of production is crucial, and that must be objective. They, quote, they did not perceive that cost, supply, demand, and price are independent and mutually determine each other. And I strongly object to that. These guys, when they say that, are describing an economy in equilibrium only an economy in equilibrium. Menger says, we're studying causality, we're not studying equilibrium. Jevons says something very similar. Menger's problem, production decisions are made today, but the output will come in the future. It'll come next year or something. So we're trying to guess what the value of the output is in the future. The value of that output in the future is not in any way dependent upon the cost of production. These things are not independent either. Think of his tobacco example. Today we produce 100 cigars, and tomorrow people decide they want to smoke twice as much as they used to, and the price goes up. Well, maybe they decide that they don't want to smoke at all, and the price goes to zero. This objective cost of production. Here, this is also the example that comes from the Austrians and from Wicksteed. Remember that Alfred Marshall argues that the cost of production could be increasing in a market, and that gives us the upward sloping supply curve. And the Austrians say, you know why that is? It's because you're taking resources out of another market, and that's a loss of utility. That's a loss of utility. So it's subjective cost, opportunity cost. And these guys don't even understand the arguments they're critiquing. Here's the problem. Well, this does bring, though, up the problem of distribution theory. How do the factor prices arise, and what are they? And a really important figure here is John Bates Clark. So let's talk a little bit about production and distribution theories. Distribution of incomes, and that's going to be related, of course, to factor prices. Now, remember how the classical economists spoke of this. Adam Smith talked about his long-run natural price concept, and he said that must be equal to the wages paid to make the good, plus the profits for the capital used in making the good, plus the land, the rent paid to the land. That's how Adam Smith characterized it. He said those payments right there must be covered by the price of the good, and then it gets split up between those things. But he could never explain how that split occurred. Ricardo tried with his corn model and came up with an incorrect story. But what is the story? Well, the Austrians and Jevons and Walras refute the classical theory of value. So what does determine those things, now is the question. Well, it turns out that this whole story of dividing it up into that, and that is all wrong. We don't need three different theories, and the three different theory thing doesn't really make sense. There is an answer. What does determine those things? It's marginal product, or really the value of the marginal product. And the important figures in this story will first of all be John Bates Clark, J.B. Clark, well, give the full name here. John Bates Clark, and also Philip Wicksteed, the Englishman, and also playing an important role, Knut Wicksell, a Swede. So let's see what they do. John Bates Clark lived 1847 to 1938, an American. So J.B. Clark. You might be familiar with this, but the most prestigious prize in economics is the J.B. Clark Award, the John Bates Clark Medal. It's most prestigious because it's not awarded by Swedish bankers, like the Nobel Prize is. It's awarded by the American Economic Association. And so that's the J.B. Clark Medal. The J.B. Clark, he lived from, what did I say, 1847 to 1938. He was from Providence, Rhode Island. 1847, 1938. Providence, Rhode Island. He studied philosophy and economics at Amherst, and he was quite interested in furthering his study of economics. There was no real graduate program in the United States at the time, and so he went to Germany, as so many did, and studied with the German Historical School. He studied with Karl Nies. If you'll remember him, he studied with this man. Nies, of course, was also the instructor and advisor to Richard Ely. Well, Clark goes there, meets Ely, and hangs out with the German Historical School, and comes back, and unlike Ely, he becomes a theorist, a marginal utility theorist, and a fierce advocate, actually, of laissez-faire. He becomes a professor at Columbia University. He was actually in the political science department. And in some ways, he could almost have a claim to being another of the marginal revolutionaries. He published a book in 1886, The Philosophy of Wealth. He claimed there that he was an independent discoverer of marginal utility theory. He's about 15 years behind everybody else, so great. His important work, 1889, he published a paper, The Possibility of a Scientific Law of Wages, Then he develops that in his book, The Distribution of Wealth, 1899. And he develops a marginal productivity theory of factor payments. Now, if you recall the ideas from the classical economists, they had all kinds of ideas about how wages, for example, came about. Well, for wages, they had the iron law of wages. The wages are driven down to subsistence. They had the wage fund doctrine. It's paid out of, wages are paid out of a fund that a capitalist accumulates. Then there's the story of Mill's recanting of the wage fund doctrine. Marx comes along and says, well, it's the exploitation and the surplus value story. And so there's a confused mishmash of doctrines. Same thing with other theories they had. Land rent, profit, they were confused. Well, Clark takes the marginal principle and the whole idea of supply and demand and applies it in a careful, consistent fashion, develops the modern theory of factor payments. Here are the assumptions he starts with. He assumes, first of all, private property. Private property and the means of production, that's protected. That's the fundamental institution in his model, in his thinking. And the second thing he assumes is competition. What do we mean by competition? Or what does he mean? What does he mean by competition? He means freedom of action. People can do as they wish in this market, but they're constrained by private property. So we also have to have government protects competition and private property. It sets the rules, makes sure people obey them. So this is followed. And then free movement of capital and labor. I'll abbreviate those, capital and labor, so you can send those to the market or the activity where you think they will earn the most. If you're a laborer, you can move to where you think you will earn the most. Capital, you can invest in whatever you think will earn the most. Great. And finally, people act to satisfy wants, or in other words, a world where there is utility maximization. That's the goal that people are pursuing. Okay, great. And he says, put those 5 things together. And what you get a system that he calls workable competition. It's a model. It's a model of an economy. It's, in a sense, static. It's not exactly perfect competition. There is some room for entrepreneurial profit and loss, for activity like this, and yet it's pretty close to being a competitive market, a competitive equilibrium. Close, but not quite. It's tending towards it. His model isn't precisely defined. It's not a complex mathematical model by any means, but rather just something he kind of describes this situation. Well, great. Well, he then asks the question, if those conditions hold, how much would an entrepreneur be willing to pay for one more unit of a factor? Capital, land, labor, doesn't matter. How much would you pay for one more unit of a factor? Will you be thinking about it? If you're a profit maximizing capitalist, you say, well, let's see, my first rule is there we go. How much to pay for one more unit of a factor? And again, a factor could be capital, labor, land, whatever. And rule number 1 is not more than it can earn for me. If you can hire one more worker and that worker will contribute $10 to your bottom line for an hour, you don't want to pay more than $10 an hour for them. Okay, that makes sense. What's that? That's the marginal product in value terms. We'll call that the marginal product in value terms. We could also call it you could also call it the marginal revenue product. I've called it that before in class. And the second rule that you'll follow is you'll pay as little as possible. If you can get it for free, great, do so. But you will pay as little as possible, but you won't pay more than that. So that defines an upper limit to what the capitalist, what the firm will pay for a factor. Great. Now, if those conditions pertain, how much will the entrepreneur have to pay? Not what do they want to pay, which is nothing, but what will they have to pay? Well, let's say that you pay less. I'm going to hire you. I pay you less than the marginal product. So let's say your marginal product is $10 and I pay you $5. Ha, I'm earning a $5 profit on you. Then what happens? Well, Dr. Wolfram hears about this and he bids, he says, I'll pay you $6 and I'll earn 10 on you and I'll have a $4 profit. And then Dr. Pongrasic says, oh, I'll pay you 7. And that way I'll get a $3 profit. And then Steele hears about that and says, I'll pay you $8. Now I'm only down to a $2 profit, but then Dr. Butters says 9, and then Steele says, all right, 10, 9.999, something like this. The process of bidding on the factors ends when the profit is 0. So you would expect in his workable competition story to be close to equilibrium. You would think that people are paying the marginal product in value terms to the factors of production, or pretty close to that. And while we're at it, I just mentioned that any unit of input is owned by someone and they can compete. So if the first worker, you have diminishing marginal product. If the first worker contributed $20 and the last worker is only, diminishing marginal product only contributes 10, you can't pay, the worker who initially hired worker isn't going to get 20. Because the other one could say, I'll do his job for 15, 14, 30, et cetera. So the units of input compete with each other as well. So, concludes Clark, every factor earns its marginal product in value terms. Great. He has a marginal product theory of factor prices, and what determines all this? Marginal utility of the final goods is underlying that demand for factors. That tells you how much that factor earns in these terms. So let's see how he can treat this graphically. Oops. Great. We're going to treat this with the labor market. And so here's the market for labor, and here's the dollars per unit of labor. And I'm going to draw the marginal product curve. You've seen this before. You saw it on one of the very first HET 1 lectures when I drew the fishery model. Great. There's the marginal revenue product going down. We'll have a nice straight line. The marginal revenue product tells us how much each additional unit of labor contributes to the total value being created here. And so that's the marginal revenue product, or the marginal product in value terms. And great. Now let's go ahead and draw in the supply curve. Where's the supply curve come from? That's the opportunity cost of laborers that came from Jevons. If you remember his kind of strangely shaped model that was something like this, where we had the disutility of labor versus the utility of labor. And he found the spot where this thing's balanced out, and where the total utility of labor was 0, the total gain, total marginal utility really, of labor was combines those two. That was the supply curve for labor. There it is, the opportunity cost to the workers, or to the factors, if it's something else. Great. Now, Clark himself doesn't consider that supply curve. We get that from Jevons. He really is just treating that right there. But what is that? That's the demand curve by the firm for labor. That's the labor demand curve. Great. And he understands then that the wage rate is the marginal product in value terms. And there's the amount of labor, of course, hired in that market. Great. What's left over? This? Well, that would be the total value being created. That must be the payment to capital. I'm not going to go through the mathematics on this, but there's another graph we could do. I'll just draw it. I won't explain exactly. We won't work out a mathematical model to show that this holds. But if it's a two-factor model, labor and capital, we would then also be able to say dollars per unit of capital employed. There's the amount of capital. There is the marginal product of capital curve. And there's the supply of capital. Great. There's the total being spent on capital. That box must match that, and that triangle must match that box. Mathematically, it works out, and that's illustrated in graphs in your textbook if you happen to have it with you. Well, good. That actually implies some kind of interesting things. I'm going to write that down now as principles in terms of some very simple algebra to state them. So let's do that. And I have here a two-factor model. I don't want to do the two-factor model. Let's make it a four-factor model. Start here. Quantity of output is equal to a function of production function capital. And we'll say that's resources or input of some sort. And then we have, what else do we have? Let's have two kinds of labor. There's unskilled labor, skilled labor, okay? Capital, resources, unskilled labor, and skilled labor. Two kinds of labor. And we also know that total revenue is equal to price times quantity. And that must be equal to, since that's quantity there, we'll just substitute all that in. That must be equal to price times price of the output, of course. Price times F of K, R, and the two kinds of labor. Great. Now, let's say that the price of labor is the price of each factor. We're going to say that the price of capital is, we'll call it R. I often use that one. That's the rental rate of capital. The price of unskilled labor is the wage rate for unskilled labor. The price of the skilled labor is the wage rate for skilled labor. And finally, for this one, we'll just call that, I don't know, what should we call it? Let's call it Z. Okay, that's the payment to the resources. Okay, that's per unit. Great. Well, now that we have that, what he has just told us is that price times quantity is equal to price times the function of capital, labor, two kinds of labor, resources, and that must be equal to the wage rate for unskilled labor times, let's put them in order, rental rate of capital times the amount of capital you use plus the wage rate for unskilled labor times the amount of unskilled labor you use plus wage rate for skilled labor times the amount of skilled labor you use plus the cost per unit of the resources times the amount you use of them. Wow. Not only that, those things must be the marginal products. So we can write it this way. The marginal product of, I'll just call it the marginal product of capital, understand it's in value terms, times the amount of capital plus the marginal product of, I guess, unskilled labor times the amount of unskilled labor plus the marginal product of skilled labor times the amount of labor plus marginal product of the resources times the amount of resources. Voila. He lays that out. He's very excited about this. He says that those factor payments will exhaust the total product that has been created. Each input is earning its marginal product. Okay. He lays that out, interesting. It's actually important for a couple of reasons. First of all, remember that for the labor theory of value, heterogeneous factors like labor, heterogeneous labor, different kinds of labor, big problem they're trying to solve. It's not a problem at all. They're just different factors. They earn different products. What's the big deal? The idea that land is special and it's just earning a residual, no, it's just another factor. It earns its marginal product. And the residual argument is all wrong. That payment is necessary. So the physical limit to land is not relevant. What's relevant is the land offered for sale or for production, and that's an economic thing. The supply of that is not fixed. Raise the price, you get more of it. Exploitation arguments for labor, that's nonsense. They're earning their marginal products. Come on. Labor doesn't earn subsistence, it earns its marginal product. Great. Well, Clark lays this out, and he says that's an economic fact, but it's not just an economic fact, it's a moral truth. It's good. It's a wonderful thing. It's a principle of justice is actually what he calls it. And that tends to dampen some of the support for his position. Well, why is that? Well, it's sort of hard to see how you go from an is to an ought. Now, the to each his own principle does make sense. What you earn is yours in this thinking. But on the other hand, the differences in earning power depend on the underlying property rights. If those weren't right, if somebody had stolen to get their capital or something like this, or they were restricted by a class structure to only be unskilled when they could have been skilled, well, it's hard to see what's fair about that. And of course, some people deny the principle of you get what you earn anyway. So egalitarians who think everything should be equal would deny that. But at any rate, Clark's made an important breakthrough here and develops that. Now, there's a real problem here, though. He has said that they're equal, but he doesn't prove it. How do we know that it isn't the case that it's those would more than exhaust the product? Or how do we know that there might not be a residual left over? Can you prove that one of those doesn't hold, and that it really holds with equality, that those will exhaust the product? And it's left to other people to show that. And it becomes a confused story, a little bit of a comedy of errors. Wieser had somewhat tackled this, but didn't make progress with it with his imputation theory. But the first person involved in this is Philip Wicksteed. So we'll have him enter the picture. And Philip Wicksteed, English economist. And Wicksteed lived from, where did he live? I don't have the dates. I think I've given them to you before. You can look that up if it's a big deal to you. But he's an economist who taught himself calculus so that he could read Jevons. He became an economist so that he could read Jevons. And then he read the Austrians, and he's heavily influenced by them as well. So he's kind of an English Austrian, sort of a proto-Austrian. In 1910, he publishes a book, The Common Sense of Political Economy. But in 1894, he wrote something. It was the coordination of the laws of distribution. And it was based on Jevons, not on Clark. But he comes up with this result. But he even comes up with something beyond it. Because Wicksteed shows in his paper that his book, he comes up with the following. He shows that this will hold. I'll just call that the J.B. Clark result. Holds if, what is it? Oh my gosh. The production function is linearly homogeneous of degree 1. Linearly homogeneous of degree 1. Say that 10 times while I'm writing. Another way of saying that is constant cost. A constant cost production function will give you that result. Well, that's a little bit disturbing to people because this seems like a great property here, if that holds with equality. But does it require that production follow that? What about a production process that isn't a constant cost production story? Well, a controversy erupts. Edgeworth, first of all, criticizes Wicksteed, probably because Wicksteed is citing the Austrians and Edgeworth gets uppity about that. And then Pareto joins in. Pareto begins criticizing Wicksteed. And with all this criticism, Walras takes note, and Walras suddenly somehow gets the idea that Wicksteed is plagiarizing Walras and begins accusing him of that. And Wicksteed is actually a real gentleman, and he's shocked by all this. He doesn't think he'd done anything wrong, but he begins wondering if maybe he had. And so when he publishes his 1910 Common Sense of Political Economy, he basically puts in a retraction and an apology. He is like, I hope I didn't do something wrong and accidentally plagiarize someone. And after Wicksteed's death, a letter is found amongst his, that he had written, but now I guess not sent, in which he confesses how shaken he is by all these accusations. Okay? But the next person to get involved in this, it turns out that Wicksteed was completely fair on this and really had an original development. But it is sort of weird because, is that what it requires? Well, the next person is Knut Wicksell. Knut Wicksell is from Sweden. He lived 1851 to 1926. Very important Swedish economist. He's from Stockholm. He was a student of mathematics. He was preparing to take on a career as a mathematician. He became interested in social reform. He became so interested in that he he abandoned Christianity. He became an advocate of temperance. See what a lack of alcohol will do to you. He wanted to eliminate poverty. He wanted to eliminate drunkenness. He wanted to eliminate prostitution. He wanted to eliminate hunger. And he began lecturing all this. And his lectures were so explicit that it was considered scandalous. And I think he got into trouble with the law, and they even threw him in jail for talking about these things publicly. But he began studying economics. He thought that was the key to reform. And he went to London and studied. He went to Germany and studied with the German historical school. He read Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, Mill, Jevons, Cornell, Walras and the Austrians, and the German historians. He eventually earns a PhD and becomes a very important economist, heavily influenced by Austrians and by the Walrasians. He does work that's important in monetary theory and interest, becomes crucial for the Austrian business cycle theory, and influences Mises. He does work in capital theory. He does work in taxation theory. If you take some of Dr. Wolfram's classes, I think his public finance class, because probably public choice as well, much of that relies on Wicksell. James Buchanan, the great public choice economist, heavily influenced by Wicksell. But for our purposes, we want to think about his production and distribution work. And the relevance to Wicksell's relevance to Wicksteed is that Knut Wicksell he defends Wicksteed and shows that he shouldn't have retracted, that he was actually right. But in doing so, he comes up with a more general solution to the problem. He shows that we don't care about what the production function is. That's not necessary. What is necessary is conditions of perfect competition. Or in other words, not really the conditions, but ultimately what that means is if we are in equilibrium, a competitive equilibrium then that holds. And it doesn't matter how many factors of production you have. That will be what happens. Every firm is producing at the minimum cost, and that every factor is earning its marginal product that exhausts the total product. Great. And so he shows that. There's some additional chapters in which it turns out that Walras still doesn't get it, and it turns out that some mathematician had actually given Walras a proof of all this stuff that he had found independently, and Walras couldn't read it because Walras didn't understand enough math and all those sorts of things. But that's the theory of distribution. The factors of production earn their marginal products. If you've got a factor market, there's the amount of the factor, call it X. We don't care what it is, land, labor, resources of some kind, capital, whatever. And there's the price of X, or rather we'll call it the marginal product of X. Great. That's the demand by firms for X. That's the neoclassical theory. Mises adopts that. It's in his Human Action, basically just states this. Quite clearly, straight from Clark, and then apply some Austrian twists to it. Great. What does that matter? That matters immensely, because what it tells us is that these prices aren't arbitrary. They actually are talking, in some sense, about the contribution that the factors are making to the final output, the way that the Austrians had argued. Socialists, central planners, don't have that, and they don't understand that. What this has told us is that factor markets are crucial to allocate the resources to the places where they will create the most value. If you don't have that, you're doing less than you could have with your allocation of resources. Clark's analysis leads him to become a great supporter of the free market, where he hadn't started out as one. When we get to the socialist calculation debate, this will come to the fore. This is going to be central, the importance of factor markets. When we get to the Soviet economy, we'll see what happens when we don't have factor markets and we try to rely on other means of making the allocations. Until then, study hard, stay well.